All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Identify and Overcome Cybersecurity Challenges, co-hosted by ISA Maverick Technologies. I'm Michaela Cooper with ISA and I'll be hosting today's webinar. But before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items to let you know how you can participate in today's session. First, in regards to the question and answer session, we have one towards the end of the webinar. To submit your questions, you'll just want to type them into the Q&A box, and that's on the right-hand side of your screen. We ask that you do not use the chat toolbox for the Q&A session. If you have miscellaneous questions for me, the host, just submit those into the chat toolbox. And unfortunately, with this amount of pre-registrants, we cannot open up the phone lines for questions. So just stay within the Q&A chat box. And if you have any direct questions for the presenter, his information will be given at the end of the webinar. Second, for those of you who just joined and are listening in through your phone line, just make sure you're on mute so you do not interrupt the presenter. And if you want to see the phone and audio broadcast instructions again, just refer to the confirmation email that I sent to you today, or if you go to the top left-hand side of your WebEx screen, you'll see a tab labeled Event Info, and some of those connection instructions are included there as well. Additionally, once this webinar closes, a survey should pop up in your browser. You'll want to take just a few minutes to fill out the survey, and we want to hear how the webinar went for you today and your experience. Okay. I think that takes care of all the housekeeping matters. I'd like to introduce our presenter, Bruce Bilodeau. He's a senior consultant in Maverick's operational consulting team, a California professional engineer with 25 years of field engineering experience. He's a member of ISA 99, Industrial Automation and Control System Security, holds a BA in economics from California State University, Fullerton, and proudly served 20 years in the United States Coast Guard Reserve. And from this point, I'm going to have Bruce take it from here and go ahead and conduct our webinar.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I see we have quite a few attendees today, which is fantastic. I said by your attendance, I assume you're going to try to tackle your cybersecurity program this year. I hope I can help you get started with that in a good way. If you come here to talk about technical solutions, we're not going to go into technical solutions very deeply. We will discuss a few of those because cybersecurity program starts far before we apply technical solutions. But I urge you to stay with me because I think I'll probably be able to save you some time and money with some pre-planning before we apply a technical solution. So with that, we're going to talk about completing an inventory of your industrial network cyber assets, performing a vulnerability assessment, and talk about where you go from there. So we'll get started. I know everybody's got things to do today, and I'm actually, for most of us, I'm probably doing this over lunch, so here you go. So why is inventory the first step? Almost every one of your cybersecurity program standards start with an inventory. The NIST framework, which just was completed in 2014, identifies that as one of the first steps you put together. The ISA 99, which is now 62443, now it's an IEC international standard, establishes that this is a fundamental thing to do. You create a network diagram. So first thing we're going to do that, let's talk about what that actually means. So this is from the standard. This is a standard. This develops the zone and conduit concept. Zones are groups of equipment. In this case, we have the business network we typically call. This would be where your historians, data servers, and things will reside. And then your industrial networks, which could be one or many, depending on zones of buildings, types of equipment. Into these, you're trying to identify not just a generic, which is kind of set up generically, but actually every device, and also including legacy field buses like Modbus, Field Bus VP, DMP3 buses, things that are not routable, separate from maybe your Ethernet buses. This is another one from the standard. This shows multiple plants or multiple zones in a plant. So breaking these down and finding out that you possibly have several historians across maybe a campus, and then you have several control zones between those. These are both inside the standards. This enterprise zone that we always talk about in the standard, most people are considering that would be the business network for a lot of plants. That's how they would look at it, your IT staff. So typically what we also see, of course, is that this level here is maintained by IT. This is clearly maintained by your automation engineering staff, or in the case of some of the people on this call, might be just the one individual who's on the call, the automation engineer or I&E engineer. This level sometimes here is a mix of the two, your IT staff or possibly your IT person and your field engineer that's working on the automation. Here's an example of a small, this happens to be a power plant that we put together for a customer years ago, back when this all got started before NERC-CIP ever started. And this basically shows the various levels and all the equipment. These levels, we have the DMZ, which is the demilitarized zone, if you don't know that term, and that just means an area that's actually accessed from trusted and untrusted networks. We also have the DCS network. This particular site actually has a DCS in addition to what we called field, which is where the PLCs were located. On top of this, we actually located where there were wireless connections. We showed all the various routes, all the switches, and security appliances associated with this site. This is the kind of detail that's required to do an inventory. You really need to know where everything is actually connected. I'll even argue that you need to know the exact port numbers that the equipment goes into, so that if you need to lock down these ports later or determine that that's a good practice, that you know which ports you're locking. Here's another one. This is a much larger site. This has a DCS with many connections. This here for an inventory shows that we have fiber optic connections throughout, many switches, types of switches, all the control room level equipment, and then it has this one type of control. So when we went and surveyed this site, we received all of this, and all it said here was this control building. So part of our survey was to find out where that actually went. And that actually went to this location here. There were a couple buses associated, and this was from the IT people. So what happens, the IT have their own diagram. This is all they had. They didn't really understand what was underneath on the DCS side, where the automation people had this very detailed diagram. So a lot of the work might already be done, but it's not been integrated to a point from an inventory. So when you're doing that, developing that network diagram, you want to locate every connected device. And this includes even USB devices sometimes, and I'll talk about that in a bit, that some USB devices actually provide access to the system. Especially with USB 2 and 3, they can actually be live serial ports that can carry routable traffic. Record the network address of the device. Determine who owns the device. This is really critical in many organizations. Some people, the automation people own it, other people. We go to surveys all the time where we find a firewall or a jump server, remote access server is another word for that, that nobody knows who manages that. And if there's no manager, that probably doesn't mean it's probably not getting patched. That probably doesn't mean it's getting any updates. It might have been, doesn't have any security applied to it because nobody's claimed ownership. So knowing who owns and manages the device is something that you should record and know for everything connected to that network. Identify its attached to domain. A lot of these devices, particularly controller and PCs, might be authenticated through a Windows domain for centralized password management. However, a lot of times they're not. Maybe they can be added fairly easily to make it easier to manage your passwords. But you need to identify the device that is attached to a domain. And which domain is it and who manages that domain? Go through and audit the name and passwords for the users on every device. very important because you're going to have to do that anyway on a regular basis. There's so many times a default password or a backdoor password was left, and nobody even is aware of it until somebody sits down and goes, oh, I always use Steven and Steven5. Yeah, that's been working for years. Nobody even knows that was there. So actually going through and identifying who the authorized users are and their passwords. If you don't know their passwords, like in a Windows machine, then at least identify the users, and if they're not identified to belong to anybody, you need to get rid of those. So something I want to talk about here is you can correct things as you're going through too. So keep a written record diagram. In the NIST plan and also in ISA, it's important that this record is not kept on your business network. One of the top things that are looked for when you have somebody come in and do a cyber attack or looking into a business network is they're looking for this drawing that you made, these records, so that they can figure out how to get through your network. So when you do keep this record, you need to keep it in a secure location. Your IT staff actually might be able to help you with this. A lot of IT systems actually have a network mapping system, and it's secure, and it's maintained and audited, and that might be a great place to keep this information. It might be just as good to keep it in a folder in a desk so that the physical security of being in the office is all that you need. So on this drawing here, you notice that I had redacted all the IP addresses, the MAC IDs, and all the other information that would help you get around the system. And that's important, especially if you're going to share these kind of things with a contractor, right? You need to have the information, but it's important that even though you have the information, you don't have it all in one document. You need to separate those out so that you can call. If you handed me this diagram, I go, that's fantastic. We'd like to configure those switches for you or make a recommendation. I can call and ask you about that information so that you can verify that it's me and that I can't just pass this drawing on with all the information onto another third party accidentally or intentionally. So it's important that when you do this, think about just basic security. Don't always put everything in the one drawing. Your IT people would that have these kind of network diagramming tools that are all automated, sometimes can help you with that. All right. Okay, so I have a question before we go on to that step here. I've got a poll question for you. And the poll question is, have you completed a thorough inventory of your industrial control system network? If anybody could pop in there and answer if you've done that, it gives me an idea of where we're standing with this group and also where we are in industry. I find that very often that we think we've done this inventory, or we're called in to do a cybersecurity inventory of a space, and really it's kind of unknown what equipment is connected. So that should only take I'll throw that for a second, and I'd love to close that real quick so we can move on. I think that just closed. And I'll go ahead and do that, and we should see the results here pretty quick. Your vendor, your contractor, something like Maverick, should develop part of that map, part of our site architecture, but you need to go through and add that extra metadata. All right, so we're about 50-50. Okay, half the people have and half the people haven't. So for those who haven't, this is something you can do with resources you already have. So before you actually even go into developing your cybersecurity program, you can complete this, and this will save you a lot of money up front, because if you are asking a third party to come in, and it's not just Maverick, but any other company who does this kind of work, this is the first thing they're going to try to do. They have to have this inventory to start. So you can save that money by starting right away. And for those who aren't sure, it's something to check into, because it's something you can do right now, usually with people you have. Sometimes it's great to even use an intern that doesn't have any knowledge of the system. They're going to go chase wires, and because they have no preconception, they might find things that you completely forgot about that you had put on the system. All right. So the next thing is, let's talk about a high-level assessment. Most of the standards say, let's go a step back and say, what is your cyber risk, right? What is their what is really your assessment? Everybody talks about like a Stuxnet, you know, Israeli or United States or some nation state came in there and got into your automation system. Well, we all know that unless you're doing something that's very interesting to them, that's not really the issue, right? If you have a nation state attack on your system, it's way beyond what most people are going to plan for cybersecurity. We're talking about more legitimate things. We'll talk about those in detail. So what you're going to do is make sure that you're only planning for things that are likely to happen and are justified by the consequence. So you take this high-level thing, then you can focus your efforts on where you should put your time and money. Because, yes, we could then design an entirely secure system with multi-layer security and after-marketing or monitoring, all of those things, but it's costly and takes time. And you might not have the funding to do it. So you want to minimize your most likely risks to have the highest consequences. And we'll go through how we do that. So part of the assessment here is that you're identifying things that might be weak points in your system, right? So you're talking about, okay, so we're going through here, and things we found in assessments is, in one case, I had found a SMS pager for texting for alarms that's sitting on the DCS network. That's fine. There's no real problem with that. A lot of people would say that might be, you know, like, oh, no, that's bad. You can't have that kind of connectivity. Well, I would argue that that's okay because it was set up, in its setup, so it'll be an outbound only device. It only send text. It didn't receive anything. It was not set up that way. Now, the mitigation of the risk of that may be as simple as a quarterly audit, right? You get the work order pops up and you say, oh, I need to go check the settings on that unit, right? And it says, oh, yep, there still is an SMS text. It's not set up as a two-way cellular bridge, which it has the possibility of being set up. Another thing, too, is the mitigation would be buy something that could not be set up as a cellular bridge. That'd be another mitigation. But the idea is to identify where these risks are and so that you can decide how much effort you want to do to minimize them. The other one there is firewalls. A lot of times everybody says, oh, there's a firewall. That solves all the problems. It is amazing how many times during our inventory and when we start thinking about the risk, we find that the firewall is there, but when we actually turn on the firewall or look into the firewall, there are no rules. It's actually just set default, all traffic in, all traffic out, or some limit to traffic in, but all traffic out. Well, and not having limitations on all traffic out, if anything gets inside that has a home run beacon call out, you basically opened up a path into your network. So firewalls are not the end all, especially if they're not audited, you know, managed, and really thought through when you implement them. All right, another thing to think about too, and that, you know, and I'm thinking is when you're going through and you identify some issues during your assessment, is thinking at this high level is like, oh, could I just adopt some best practices immediately? One thing here is reduction in firewalls. I just talked about the issues with firewalls. But another thing about firewalls too is sometimes, depending on the organization, they're very expensive to maintain. We have some clients that use third parties to maintain their firewalls. And that can cost you between, you know, $5,000 and $20,000 a year for a third-party management of the firewall. Additionally, those firewalls are sometimes managed, you know, overseas or a long way away, so changing them is fairly difficult. So reduction in firewalls could save you money. A firewall is an expensive solution to a problem. They have to be maintained. There are some great other products, and I'll bring some of that up now, is, you know, data diodes or pre-configured firewalls for automation that might actually do better than a generic firewall. The other part too, as I talked about before, is that SMS thing shown here by the radio here, that there probably needs to be in a constant audit, or might even have to have a constant monitoring, where you would actually put something on that PC there and you would say, okay, if I ever see inbound traffic from this port, I'm going to send an alarm out because that's never supposed to happen. So that's part of that monitoring concept, which is very far down in a typical cybersecurity program. All right, so we're going to talk about our assessments. I talked about earlier, Stuxnet, right? You know, attack by nation state, very unlikely event. Let me talk about a bunch of other unlikely events so that you can focus on where you really should be worrying about when you're doing your assessments. when we talk about there is that, you know, oh, you get this all the time, and I see these during cybersecurity discussions all the time. Somebody's going to get a hold of your system and overflow the dam. They're going to get in your system and damage your turbine. They're going to get in your system and do this. And I think most of us on this call understand that's just not credible. I mean, automation systems fail all the time. And if you have a system where your automation system fails and actually causes physical destruction of your system, you possibly have a really poorly designed system. You don't have the right mechanical safeties. You don't have the right overall safety design. So I think that doesn't pass a credibility test. And I think when you start this, when you go out for funding for a cybersecurity program, and you say, oh, well, you know, the plant might blow up if they get into our system, I don't think that passes the smell test, which is why I think some people find it really hard to get funding for cybersecurity programs. All right? So I'm going to go through it quick. I like to bring this one up. In 2010, there was an attack of a steel plant. They used spear phishing through email, social engineering. They got into the network. There were frequent control failures. Eventually, the blast furnace couldn't be shut down, and there was actually damage to the refractory, and it was actually a fairly nasty thing. It was done by somebody who really wanted to get to that plant. Now, part of that, when you look into it, is that it didn't have a backup plan in place, a standard backup plan to reload the PLCs or the controllers so that they could get back to a known state after a known attack. So this is the only thing. The only one that's been more recent was, obviously, there was an attack on the grid in Ukraine just a couple of weeks ago. It probably was a nation state or a really, really sophisticated organization. So that's something to think about, particularly if anybody's on the phone here from the electrical utility portion. So we're not really looking at attacks that are going to damage our facility. The next two to talk about is the media really talks about attacks on large corporations. Huge corporation was attacked. Now, these might be industrial corporations, oil producers, oil refiners, chemical facilities, large manufacturing plants, auto manufacturing. Those kind of places, they always say they have these breaches. Boeing, let's say, for an aircraft manufacturer, they have these breaches. But all those cases, except for a very, very limited amount, are always cases of business systems. These are your IT group's problems usually. They're trying to get a hold of plans, financial data, things they can sell on the black market. We have to really remember, and I think all of you understand on this call, that the business system is where the good stuff comes from. It's really hard to get good data that you can sell in the black market from an automation system. I mean, most of us get onto a program, we can't even figure out what it's doing if it's not properly documented. It takes hours to figure this out, and all you're trying to figure out is if the level in the tank, you know, responds properly. So when we're looking at that, you have to think about the business system is where most of these breaches are happening. Now, if you can breach a business system, of course, that means they possibly can get into your automation system. So that's something to think about when you're doing your assessment. But it's not really the biggest problem. Your biggest problem, and you already know what your biggest problems are, disruption of production, right? You have an operation going on and it gets disrupted because something happens with your automation system. Happens already. You already know this, right? This happens all the time. We get PLCs fail. We load in a new PLC and nobody has the current DCS or PLC program. Hey, where's the program at? Oh, it was on the laptop. Oh, it's on that CD. Oh, the CD's bad. Oh, we're going to have to rewrite that program. That whole part of the process is down for a week now until we get the contractor out here. Missing drivers or configuration software. Oh, IT upgraded upgraded the engineering tool. Oh, that's great, but they didn't have the right drivers, so we don't have anything in the plant to reload that PLC. Oh, we put the wrong program in. Now, in this case, you caused the problem yourself. You're your own cybersecurity problem. Load a program in there. That automation system did something, overstroked the valves, destroyed the valve. In that case, maybe you did get some physical destruction, but it was of your own making. Loss of passwords. So one of the biggest things going on now in cybersecurity is we're talking about putting passwords and implementing that in all the PLCs in the plant. Well, we already know how bad password management is at the control room level. So what are we going to do when we have it on our PLCs? You know, there's some ways around it, and we always have some recommendations about where you put passwords on PLCs. I like a mix, personally, if we're talking about this, a mix of things like physical security and password security. So let me just show you an example of how I would mitigate a lost password, just as an aside. I would put the password actually in the cabinet, right there on the processor, right? So if you need access to that unit, the password's on the processor. I would also lock the door to the cabinet. I would put a tamper switch on the cabinet that opens and goes to the control room. So you have then a policy. It says anytime that panel is open, somebody has to call the control room first and they log access. So then you know who's been in the cabinet and who's seen the password. And then what happens is that you always have it. So if something happens, you can go directly to the cabinet, get the password, load the stuff on. The beauty of having the password is if somebody gets into your system that's unauthorized, they don't have the password. It's not written anywhere in your system. You can't find it. You actually have to go to the cabinet to get it. So it takes somebody on the inside and somebody that's regularly tracked. So it's more of a policy issue, less than a technology issue. Inadvertent virus infections, this is probably one of the greatest issues that we have in the system, is that virus infections come in on USBs and laptops or browsing on the internet because the firewall wasn't configured so they could browse from it from the control room. The other part we get on these is disruptive polling. So we have a lot of times we have a business system that's pulling data from the automation network, and it's not really set up robustly where it should probably go to a point server, but it's actually pulling it directly from a PLC or a DCS port, and it's misconfigured. Somebody updated something out of the business network, didn't understand what was going on, and it's over-polling the system and actually causing failures in the automation system. Curious employees. I was a curious employee. That's probably how I got into this in the first place, is that, you know, somebody that has excessive access over their skill or knowledge level. So they're not necessarily bad. They're not necessarily hackers, but it's somebody that probably should not have that kind of access. So they have privileged access when they shouldn't. That's really a management issue. It's not a technology issue. And then lastly is power failure. You know, if you have a power failure and you don't have the right battery backups or you haven't maintained your battery backups, all of a sudden that will show that you have missing PLC programs, missing drivers, you've lost your passwords. All those things happen after a power failure because you weren't really paying attention to just the power going to the units. I've surveyed several locations that when I've tested the backup power, none of it's worked. And even when I've asked to have it fixed, it hasn't been fixed for up to years. So that's something to keep in mind. These are your current threats. What's nice about this, and something to keep in mind, is if you solve these problems, or you identify these are your problems, you fix this, you've fixed the external problems, or most of them. So when the benchmark companies for cyber attacks, it really follows together. We get viruses and worms and malware. Those are the things that go, you know, the classic thing. We even had a customer who got a virus infection from a USB that got onto their control network, you know, for the HMI, and brought them all down. The virus wasn't targeted for this place. It was just inadvertent. Malicious code is much less. Malicious insiders are even more less. But every once in a while, you get a disgruntled employee, and that's where having the proper level of authority for that employee is an important mitigation technique. And then, of course, physical and social engineering, that's when they call, hey, I can't get in on the contractor. Could you connect up that phone line or the external access point, you know? All right, so I always argue that it's the USB or the contractor's laptop. So here's my next poll question. Do you have a policy or a program to inspect a contractor's laptop before they're connected to your control system? I get about a 50-50 here. My greatest mitigation technique is that don't let anybody in with a laptop. You really should spend the money to to have your own configuration software and your own engineering workstations or your own engineering laptops. Okay, all the stuff you need to get your system back online, you should own. Now, there's a little bit more front-end investment for that and a little bit more maintenance because you have to make sure you have the right drivers, but they are correct. And for some of the automation systems, most of the people on this call know that you might not have the most current one. So if the contractor shows up with, you know, version 20 when you're running version 17, it becomes a problem. They've got to get the earlier version drivers and all that, where it'd be better if you just had your own tool. So is hoping on there? All right. So I got a 50-50 also. That's fantastic. So I applaud you that do have a program for the Contractors Laptop. That's excellent. And that, you know, I hope that maybe you don't even allow them. The last couple of customers I've done survey for don't allow them at all, and I think that's probably the best mitigation. For those who don't, you need to think about that. At a minimum, you need to scan them, or that they have their own program. Ask your contractor, do they have a program for cybersecurity for their own engineering laptops they use? And for those who aren't sure, it's time to ask the question. So part of the assessment is, you know, thinking about things that can happen to us. But then we have to think about how much they cost us. And I like to use this metric. How much does an hour of downtime cost your organization? That is a metric almost every organization knows, particularly a manufacturing organization. It's a number that the accountants, the board, finance people, your manager, yourself, all understand. That's a metric you understand, you know, cost per hour, cost per week, cost per month. That's the way that you can then make this cybersecurity real when you actually have to go get some funding to hire personnel or block out time or buy equipment. This is the number that makes it real. So when we walk through that, think about it also in subzones. So when you talk about organization, yes, I understand. If your entire refinery goes down, you know, it's going to cost you multi-millions of dollars. That is not the likely event. The likely event is that in plant zone A, right here, that a contractor was working in the area and brought down the data connection inadvertently, and when they brought down that data connection, that section of the plant went out. We can run the remainder of the plant for 20 hours before we have any problem with this. There's actually no impact for 20 hours or less. That's an important thing to know, right? Because that's going to affect how you design in your cybersecurity solutions. You know, a contractor dug up the fiber optic line, but we've got tank storage for 3 days. Nothing happens when we get it fixed in 3 days. Okay, that kind of helps you focus on where it's important. Over here in plant 3, that's an outbound thing. When that part goes down, we stop loading. That's immediate money, right? Now we're counting by tens of thousands of dollars an hour is costing us when plant C's control zone goes down. So if I was focusing my cybersecurity efforts, I'm going to probably focus some more on the plant C, right? If I'm going to put in some monitoring, and I've got only so many points I can monitor for a certain cost, I'm going to focus on this latter section instead of on plant A, where I have more time for recovery. So it's really important that you break that down when we're talking about loss of production into cells if you have a large enough plant that occurs. I have a little side note here, is that I went to a dairy. I was at a small dairy up here where I live in Michigan, where it's snowing outside. And this dairy, and I asked him, okay, we're talking about cybersecurity because the FDA had asked him about it. I go, what's their cybersecurity program on here? And he says, well, I got a great cybersecurity program. I have my system all backed up, and I put this in a fire safe on my backup, including the configuration software, and it all goes in a safe outside in the office away from the plant. And he goes, if somebody ever came in on my internet access here on the plant and dropped all my equipment off and all my dairy equipment wouldn't work, he goes, we just turn it off, disconnect the internet, clear the units off, and reload them from scratch. He goes, yeah, it takes us 4 hours or so to do something like that. He goes, but that doesn't affect our production. We're okay. We can do a 4-hour outage. He goes, we already have a written plan to do that. That's how we're going to address it. And so they believe they have addressed their cybersecurity problems. So if you have a very small plant and you can handle a lot of downtime, maybe good backups. But good backups also work if you have a failed PLC. So it solves two problems at once. So we're trying to get how frequent these happen. So when we're talking about this here, we're going to frequent that. You know, how often have you had this in the past? Look back at your old work orders, right? Most of the people on this call here goes, oh yeah, I remember last year that, you know, we had a dead PLC and it took us 3 days to get the PLC program loaded in it, right? Or, you know, last year that we had some problem over on the business network when it was pulling up inventory data. You know, that happens twice a year and I got to call IT. That gives you an idea of how often this is occurring, right? So it's at least happening that often. So if you can design a system to mitigate those problems, you've already mitigated a lot of what would be called your external threats for cybersecurity. So the risk equation, likelihood of the event times the consequence equals the risk, right? So it's a straight engineering calculation. I think a lot of you on the call would be very familiar with this concept because really the business risk is what's going to drive funding your program. And as I bring this all the way around, unless you justify it by showing actual monetary risk, it is very difficult to get management to move forward on a program because a good cybersecurity program takes time, effort, money, organization, recording all these as policies, training of individuals, all right? So we want to do as least of that as we need, but we do need to do that, and to do that, you have to monetize the risk. It is a business. We find very often that we have a lot of recommendations we give and they never get implemented because we have to go back and develop that cost risk to the client. Just identifying that you have an unconfigured firewall is not compelling to the person in accounting. All right, next question. Does your organization do HazOps? I'm just going to throw this out to see if anybody, how many people on the call actually have these kind of facilities, so I know my group here, so we're throwing that up here. HazOps basically is been developed over the last 20 years as a way of trying to mitigate risks, mostly in production plants. I remember when in the Coast Guard we first started this on shipboard when they're trying to assess, you know, how much firefighting equipment a ship really should have, how many teams they should be trained with, how often they should train, you know, how often do these things occur. And a lot of times, of course, we just design out the problems. We've done this with, you know, housing years and years ago, you know, design out the risk, right? That's one solution. But you have to do a hazard assessment to find out if it's really worthwhile to do so. So I'm hoping that I see up here comes up with a poll, should be there pretty quick. So part of our assessment is we've identified these hazards, which is just like a HazOps, which is a part of our assessment. We know what we're dealing with. All right, fantastic, 67. Well, I'm hoping I was talking to the right crew here. That's fantastic. Well, a HazOps, for those who haven't, this is really a good standard to pick up. This is pretty much a industry, worldwide industry standard on approaching the minimization of risk. So I would highly recommend that. So right here we have the risk equation, how it's put out here. And this is typically, if you've done HazOps in your organization, then you already have this drawing, right? You already have something like this matrix already made for your plant. I ask for this when I go in and do cybersecurity reviews because I'm trying to monetize the risk. So let's talk about what that means for those who aren't familiar with them. But what I'm talking about here is I'm going to say something is risk area, it's a manufacturing outage at a single site per day. It's going to be cost me less than, $5 million, and it has no little impact on my company. Something that's just very localized, right? So that's going to be a very low risk, okay? So it gets over here. But I might also be looking at something that is very high risk, right? And we see this sometimes even with Chipotle, right? Their public confidence and loss of brand. For they had such a poor or ineffective way of determining the bacterial infection on their food that they actually lost brand image. That was far more important than the actual number of people that are actually affected, because it was much more there. So that makes it a high importance thing to mitigate. So this one here is something that I believe most of you are familiar with. And if you've done these kind of analysis when you're doing a process plant and you're saying, okay, I'm doing a high level alarm, I'm going to have automatic pump cutoff, so I have a still rated system to mitigate a risk. And you've already gone through all this. You've already done a cybersecurity assessment. You just need to change your focus from being on a plant process to the larger idea of the site of your network and how you mitigate the risks of that network. So we talked about developing a compelling business rationale, an inventory of the system, how we prioritize the threats by using a risk analysis, estimating that business impact. With those two things in hand, you're ready to do the next step, which is developing mitigation techniques, and that would be applying firewalls, applying policies. You're going to assemble a team. Your IT staff or IT individual is an excellent resource. They might have a lot of these things they can help you out with. They might not know how to do it themselves or are afraid to because they don't understand your system, and possibly shouldn't even be directly involved because they have a different focus on the IT level, on the business network. But they should be part of your team. You should be part of this team. I argue that your EH&S personnel should be part of this team. They do a lot of training, teaching people how to have good cybersecurity, would be not bringing in USBs, not picking up stuff, not answering questions on the phone to people you don't know about, not talking about it when they're out at night. Those kind of practices, your EH&S, environmental health and safety people, toolbox talks, those are really helpful. And that's low-cost training, and that can mitigate a lot of these things. So you need to add those people to your team. You need somebody in accounting so that they can bring, or finance, that they can bring forward that in words that the board understands that you can get the kind of funding you need. So that's your next step. You need to go from there. And then you can develop that program. But as you can see today, nothing I said talked about developing a program. What I said today was preparing to develop a program. And if you do it this way, you'll find out you'll be able to develop a program at the lowest cost, at the most effective manner, with the least effort. So there you go. So I guess I'd like to open that up for questions and see what we can answer there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce. Like you said, we're going to move into the Q&A portion of this webinar. So like the slide says, enter your questions into the Q&A box. It's on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen. And we'll go ahead and start with the first question here. What tools have you used for, 1, network discovery, and 2, vulnerability assessments?
All right. I use the CSET tool. Is the tool that I use when I do my assessments, and that's available free from Department of Homeland Security for my ICF cert. That's the tools we use to do our actual data assessments, and it's question-based, and so that you can download that from ICF cert. I wish I would have a little screen up there for you, and I'll actually walk you through. You can, in the ICF cert tool, you can select which standards you want to meet. There's several of them. If you have a federal project you're working on or non-federal, you can select things that are applicable. If you have much more data associated, if you're working in aerospace, you might have to meet certain federal security standards. If you're getting federal money for certain projects, with those you would select some of these federal projects. In the other case, you could set just ISA 99 62443's industrial cybersecurity. It will actually lead you through questions that you can answer and help develop before you even start, so you can do that assessment. The other thing is network discovery. It is we do not do network discovery, electronic network discovery on any systems we do. We do it all by hand. You can do, there's several tools to use that you can actually snip on a line and listen, but if the device on the network isn't broadcasting, you'll never see it. We think it's more important to actually just go down and chase down every individual item. That's in case, especially like if you're finding a USB connected cellular modem or something, it wouldn't show up on a discovery tool. So from our point of view, we don't like automated discovery tools. Some people have good luck with them, but we find them that can be disruptive to the system.
Okay, thanks. And we had a question about your email address. It's slightly off, so just so everybody knows, on this slide it's bruce.billida@mavtechglobal.com. So I'll also be sending around an email with your email address as well, with your correct email address. Okay, so the next question is, if a vendor wants to connect a laptop in the network to configure, then what care should be taken, as we will not have control on the applications running on his system?
Right. So we have various things. One is do they have, the first question to ask, and you can ask this in your PO when you actually bring a vendor in, is do they already have a program for this? For example, if Maverick itself, we're vendor independent, so we don't really promote any particular vendor. We have some that we are default designed to, but we're pretty familiar with a lot of the vendors. Many of the large vendors have some fairly sophisticated programs for this, so that they have their own engineering laptops, which have a program, and they only get their updates through a VPN to a known site at corporate headquarters for that vendor, and they have a program, and they can actually give you that program as part of the process of through the PO process, right? You should request if they have a program. If they don't have a developed program, if it's a smaller vendor or a smaller support staff, then you can check their unit itself and make sure, do they run antivirus, right? Pull it up. Do they run? Is the antivirus current? Do they have on their system the updated patches? Have them run Windows Update right there, right? Have them do a scan of their machine before they connect using their antivirus. Some very minor things, malware or programs on there. So to see, do they actually already have this and use it? Because if you pull up their unit and say, oh, could show up because see Windows Update, and they haven't updated it for 2 months, you can question that vendor's commitment to safe access to your system.
Okay, great. Our next question is, what about ransomware in industrial systems?
Well, I read about this all the time. We've had a lot of ransomware. The Australians have had a real problem with ransomware on hospitals. They've been tying up equipment or tying up data, personal data, electronic medical records. And with a big push here in the United States for electronic medical records, you can see how that could be. And typically right now, just so you know, for how the Secret Service looks at this, they just recommend you pay the ransom. That's an actual official position that they take, is that they say that paying the ransom, then you know where your system was weak and now you should go back and fix it. You should take ransomware as a warning. Now, that might be fine, but if it takes your system down for a while, that's not good. I have not personally read about any ransomware that's occurred on an industrial system. And anybody who's on here who might have heard about one, I'd love to hear about it so that I can share it with other people in the future. I have not heard about ransomware. I think it might be more difficult than you think because you have to have an intimate knowledge of the various control systems and also the value of maybe your historian. So the databases and the point servers that we run on these systems are not generic. So most of the ransomware we've seen are database encryptions. So they're taking a database they find, which is in a simple database file in SQL, and they can go ahead and encrypt that. And that's pretty much done. And a lot of that stuff is just done automatically. It's not actually, there's no human being going, oh, I found it. No, it's a piece of tool which finds this database, encrypts it, and then sends back the notice to the owner saying, the owner of the encryption software that says, okay, we found one. Here's you know, the contact information. You can go ahead and ask them for the ransom. So a lot of that stuff is not targeted. It's actually just wandering in the wild and reports home when it actually encrypts a database. So I haven't heard about one, and I think it's mostly just because our HMI systems are not very generic.
Okay, next question is there any penetration test / tools that can be run on an industrial network without disrupting the network?
Yeah, well, some people claim there are, and that's really the difficulty, is that you're trying to do a penetration test actually on a network that, you know, really is not. I skipped the slide back up here, but it was talking about denial of service attacks are really an issue for legacy automation systems because they're not really designed for it. You know, I still work on some old Rockwell stuff that's been upgraded to Ethernet. You know, the Ethernet stack is about 3/4 of the memory in the unit, and you hit that with too many requests, it brings down the whole PLC pretty quickly. So penetration tests are difficult because they can disrupt traffic, as you probably already know. I'm not really familiar with one that we would use. It's not our standard right now for Maverick. There are a couple vendors who claim it. I think you're better off doing that as a more manual effort, or you know, having it a monitored event so that you can go to the switches and you can monitor the level of network traffic. So when you do your penetration test, that you do a controlled version where you would say, okay, we're gonna never let the test exceed, you know, 20% increase in traffic or something. So there's possibly a way, in a well-managed way, you could do it. I wouldn't recommend anything. We don't have anything we recommend. So.
Okay, next question. Once you've performed an assessment, how often should you refresh / confirm the information?
Well, all the standards say annually. So there's what the standards say. I think it comes down to, really partly when you have an assessment, I think that we kind of go to annual as a default on a calibration of our field instruments, you know, basically that guy. In fact, it's interesting that we spend more time calibrating our field instruments than we do reviewing our code or even viewing our firewall rules a lot of the times. Like I said, I mean, I see places where UPSs for power aren't even assessed on an annual basis. So I would say things. The other ways of doing it, you could do it as we do as a modern maintenance management system. You know, we could say, we haven't had any errors, you know, statistical analysis, we haven't had any errors for a while. You know, we can lengthen out that. Another way of doing it is just saying, okay, every time I have a personnel change, let's reassess that, right? I got somebody who leaves. I had one place where I went down there and I found out they hadn't changed the passwords on their satellite connectivity for 10 years. And there had been over 100 people change in the organization that all could access that. And so basically they could have backdoored into their system. So maybe when a major personnel changes or a significant person, and that might be, you know, every 3 or 4 years, a small pipeline operation might not need to do an annual assessment. They might only need to do, you know, as personnel changes. So it has a lot to do with your company, but the standards all say annually.
All right, next question. If data on the consequences of cybersecurity defects is kept confidential by most companies, how do you expect to convey the importance of investing in cybersecurity improvements to business leaders?
I need this person on my team here. That's where we went back, and when we started doing these assessments, we were going to go out and just do our inventories and suggest answers, and we kind of did some of this, right? It's like, and this is a lot of the vendors have the same problem. They go out and they say, oh, we got this great data diode, you know, the one way, or we have this way of, you know, deep packet inspection on Modbus, you know, great devices, right? So they come and they say they're this much. How do you convince anything that's the problem? That's why in this presentation, I really focused on things that already occur, right? So try to go back to disruption. We have already had disruption. So you could even say a 1+, because we had 5 disruptions last year. We've identified that, you know, if we just had one more, it would be this disruptive and worth this much. That's one reason I concentrate on disruption, because it's something, at least in the management, they can see that, oh, yeah, I saw those disruptions. You know, what are we going to do to mitigate those? Also, there is some stuff, especially in ICS CERT from the Department of Homeland Security, that they actually have some data that's been shared. And with the new laws last year that says that a company cannot be penalized for sharing that data, that we might actually get more of that sharing data. But they actually do have some statistics on actual breaches from ICS CERT, which is public domain and might be able to be used as in conjunction with your own analysis that I suggest you make.
Okay. What other software tools do you use in ICS systems for cybersecurity?
You know what? One of the best ones is, you know, Wireshark is probably the one that's probably the most common that we like to use. You can put that on there and record traffic for a long time. It's passive. You can apply it directly on any one of the systems or on a switch. So that's probably one of the biggest tools that we use to identify traffic. Also, vendor, vendor design tools are good. Most of the vendors actually have network monitoring equipment already for just quality of service, and monitoring that traffic just from a level is a great way of doing detection. So a lot of your switches will actually have that kind of monitoring now. I mean, a really low-cost thing, a nice industrial switch will actually have its own embedded tools, right? So it's looking for data storms or, you know, repetitive broadcasts that are outside the norm. It actually, a lot of that software is built into the switches, and that will send out alarms to appropriate personnel. So if you're just doing it, we're just doing a basic analysis. So I use Wireshark. It's free and easy to use. But a lot of the tools that are built into your network switches that you already own, they're already on site, are usable, and the vendor tools. I know Rockwell and Siemens both have some pretty good tools now for watching network traffic and determining if something's out of band.
All right, we'll only take a few more questions here as we're coming close to the top of the hour. Could you give us a brief about the cyber attack that happened in Ukraine power grid?
Yeah, unfortunately, I only got the small summary of it. I haven't been able to look into it. There hasn't been a formal report. I haven't received a formal report on it yet. I hope to do that within next week, so I apologize. I'd be more than happy to follow up with any one of you on that to discuss it. It was a transmission level attack, as far as I understand, which anyone in the power organization knows that it's very likely that it was a manipulation of the breakers at substations, and that's as far as I can tell at this point. But that was very, you know, preliminary, so I can't give you a summary on that. I wish I could. I've just read about it last week, and I haven't been able to educate myself on that myself.
All right, next one. Do you have any customers that conduct cybersecurity drills that would simulate potential events?
No, but I'd love them to. Yes. No, it'd be very interesting. However, you know, it's an interesting thing to do that. If I got to go to the red team, blue team out in Idaho Falls with the Department of Homeland Security, and we spent a week there in cybersecurity class, and and it's free, by the way, to industry. And if you're an end user in industry, they're the kind of person they want to go. And it's free. You just have to get there and put yourself up in the hotel in Idaho Falls. It's fantastic training, and you actually do that kind of simulation. The difficulty is that the kind of drills, the kind of people that you need to do this kind of, especially if your system's reasonably secure, are some pretty sophisticated abilities. Some of your IT staff may be able to do it, but if you're doing it on a running plant, to do a real drill, you know, you'd actually have to affect equipment, and that might not be safe. So no, I have yet to see a customer actually have a developed program. I think if you're already doing that, you're far, far ahead of the main group.
All right, this is the last question we'll take. Do you recommend blocking all USB ports in all ICS computers and in the entire system, or is it better to install a software tool in the network to check USB devices as they're connected to the network?
Well, this is part of your assessment, but let's just say if you're starting from blocking all, I prefer to block all. The reason why is that it's really hard to tell what you're looking for. With RUM cells, it's the unknown unknowns is the problem. And I would prefer to actually, if you, especially ICS computers, if you don't actually do that, go into the computers and actually remove the little jumper wires to the USB if possible. Or there's several tools now that actually fill the spots. Part of that physical security would be to actually, remember, you have to seal the back of the computers, actually put tamper seals on them, right? And that's part of that if you're going to block off USBs. A lot of customers that we have a single computer that has one, that if you need to bring something in USB, you can bring it in on there, or you take it to IT, let them take the information off of that, and then bring it down into a safe place on the network where it can be grabbed for the ICS network. That's probably the best because they're more familiar with the ongoing differences in threats on a USB than your ICS thing and keeping that software updated. So for me, I suggest sealing the PCs and closing off all the USBs is the best approach. I also feel that all unused ports on switches should be locked out and password protected also. So it's a small, low-changing system, usually, so there's no reason not to lock out everything you can.
All right. Well, that concludes our Q&A session and concludes our webinar. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you to all those who participated in the Q&A session. This has been a great webinar. If you missed any portion of this webinar, or if you'd like to watch the recorded version or share it with your colleagues, we did record it, and we'll be emailing all those who registered with a link to the recording and along with some additional resources for you. So be on the lookout for an email from me in the next couple days. And like I said at the start of this webinar, there's going to be a survey that's going to pop up once you click out of this webinar. Be sure to just take a few minutes to tell us about your experience today. And this concludes How to Identify and Overcome Cybersecurity Challenges webinar. Thank you for attending. We hope you acquired useful information. We hope to see you again in one of our future webinars.